The crown as a political symbol. Um, this is a question for the history of political thought about the usage of the concept or the symbol of the crown representing not only the king or the dynasty, but the realm, the body politic, the commonwealth. The concept of the crown, in my argument, is that it was the attempt to put into symbolic representation uh, 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 the connection between the agent of rule, the king, and the thing ruled, the realm or the kingdom. Now, this use of this concept of this crown came, the basic fundamental idea that emerged out of where it came from was from medieval Christian theology, tying to the concept of the body of Christ. Christ was both Christ, that body, but also could be things, the church, the elements of the Eucharist, the Catholic theological concept of the Eucharist, the bread and the wine are the actual, also physical presence of Christ. Even though it's bread and wine, um, Christ is also there in this scholastic / neo-Aristotelian concept of transubstantiation. That therefore, that although the outward appearance of it is that of bread and wine, but the real inward and actual thing is that of Christ's wine, his blood, and the bread, his body. Now, in Catholic theology, this concept is being politicized in the Middle Ages, in that this concept of this duality in the nature of the being, and to this, and this person can be also present in the other things, material things, like body, or a corporate entity, the church. Um, Medieval law relied intellectually on not only on Roman law, but also took in Christian concepts. I think what happened around, very early in the time of, let's say, 8th, 9th century, during the Roman Empire started to collapse, particularly in in the context of Western Europe. What emerged was just basically the realms of collapsed institutions. The imperial authorities and the basic cities that emerged reverted to, civic / polis life, and trying to survive. And elsewhere, the surviving household estates, the state of prominent people and prominent citizens in the empire who lived in that, or people who took over those from the actual citizens, took possession of estates and territories. That what replaced the Roman Empire in this period of European history was these landed estates, basically a combination of institutions. The most common institution was the estate, okay, the specific estate, and the feudal contract between the peasantry or the population that was around, either former slaves under the Roman Empire, or the various tribal barbarian people who came to rely on and use the land that the person claimed, the so-called feudal contract between the landlord and the labor population, who then served on that population, but were not seen as owners, or they were considered part of the estate. They became servants or slaves, even though they were not slaves in the traditional sense. They might, as the concept of serfs or peasantry was in fact more akin to the pre Roman understanding of slaves in that sense, servants. They weren't necessarily free to go into any. Now, the concept of the crown is, which going back to it, is this attempt to represent this authority of the not only symbolic aspect of the authority of ruling. The crown symbolizes the king's difference from his subjects, but it also represents an idea. The crown becomes symbolic not only of the king's person or the king's rule, but also the thing being ruled. That is the realm, the territory. Now, we know that this is something that occurs in particularly English common law regarding property. This idea that property is very much tied to the person. This is why in 12th century and 13th century records of transfers in English common law records, there is this need to alienate. You needed to alienate the property before you could sell your property. To sell a piece of property, to sell some ground or an estate to someone else. First, you needed to alienate it. That is, to make it to separate. And it's also, this use of the concept to alienate, and thus things that are inalienable in law, things that you cannot transfer or you cannot separate yourself. This becomes the basis by which that concept emerges in law, to separate or not to be something that could not be separated. And this is where this how this language gets into something like the Declaration of Independence, the talk of inalienable rights. This owes itself more to the concept of Hobbes and Locke, in the sense that Hobbes sees the formation of the body politic as through a social contract by which citizens, the members, agree to surrender their natural liberty to do what they want, do what they will, and they surrender that collectively to the collective, to each other as a collective. That instead, what everyone promises and this contract secures is their security, their safety, and their well-being. This is as much true for Locke as it is Hobbes. Now, the only difference we can say in Locke is that there's a greater concern for property, that in other words, property plays a much more important role. Securing a property, guaranteeing property, maintaining a property rights, which is understood for Locke as something existing as a right prior to man's entering into society. That property exists by the nature of man's making and man's doing and acting and towards the physical world. That property is a product of man's actions and labor. This is, and because of that, the Locke's and Hobbes's concepts seem different. But this is a tangent. But I wanted to say about this for a second because it's important, because this is the way this means by which the individual members form the collective whole in the social contract theory is the basis for the creation of the state. Now, why this is important for the concept of the crown? Because by the reign of Tudor period, late Tudor period, and the rise of the Stuarts, the concept of the crown and the concept of the state merged. Kind of in other words, the structure of the king and the understanding of the king really fundamentally started to change at the time of the Tudors, and that particularly the Tudors idea of actually glorifies the crown as a symbolizing unit of the realm of the authority. Now, this was present previously, but it's something that becomes more clear, and it also becomes the means by which a new concept, the Stato of Machiavelli and the Italians, come into the English structure. In other words, the state and the logic of the collective administrative modern centralizing state is clearly brought into play in this at this point. And the crown becomes the instrument that does it. Now, and this also explains why, in many ways, the English transition to the state was less drastic and less destructive to the pre-existing institutions. Thus, we have to understand that the English crown from 1066 at the Norman conquest and the Plantagenet reign, even though it ruled at one level over other fiefs and fiefs, be it either in their territories and properties in France or later in their authority over Wales and Ireland and Scotland, very much in the similar way that continental monarchs did to this kind of these autonomous aristocratic or territorial eras, and therefore had to there was either kind of a you know a rule by force and authority, but also a kind of more consensual basis. But that was not the case in England. The English, the lords or the English aristocracy all owed their title to the English king. This was not true in the continent for the most part. The continental, many of the aristocratic orders and aristocratic people had their claim prior to any particular king. Either and therefore sometimes their claims predated a given dynastic order. Okay. So therefore, 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 the centralization of power on the crown in the 15th, 16th, and 17th century in the continent was far more contentious and required uh, a kind of taking power away from either aristocrats or bodies like the church or free cities, and the centralization of power on the crown. Now, in England, this happened at 1066 when William the Conqueror comes in and conquers England, and therefore imposes an administrative centralization, both in terms of land, all land becoming his, and therefore what happens is there's kind of a transferring to the thing in use or that, but upon and lifetime, you can you can use it. It was yours. You could transfer it. But if there was, if you died without children, or you're committed treason, or something, some you broke the agreement by which the land or territory was given, it was reverted back to the crown. It reverted back to the king. And that and unlike even though they were monastic orders that were autonomous and that they appealed to other sources, the um, the English ecclesiastic authority, for the most part, was something the crown, the English king, cared of maintaining and controlling. Hence the famous story of Richard the sorry, Henry II and Becket. No, Becket was Henry the second's buddy. Henry basically is picking up again where what William the First left off. William's reign does not, he is a kin of the Norman line of William, but he was a little further away. And as a dynastic problem happened within, three generations past the conquest, um, um, Henry's in the Plantagenet rule established a centralization of English rule. In fact, with Henry II, that political in England political sense, even though he was ruling an empire of lands on Agenor, married to Catherine, with her lands, his own lands, and the Norman lands. All of this together, that's why during the time of Plantagenets, the English had a vast territorial rule on the continent, particularly in France. with very vast baronies, ducals, and duchies tied to their rule. But in regards to England, it was more centralized in their authority. And as with Richard and various people coming after, Henry coming after Henry, that we get the framework of law. Now, for the jurisprudence, Bracton Henry de Bracton is probably the most chronicler of law. And it is Bracton brings us the first representation of the crown and the role of the crown in the framework of law, representing not only representing the king's authority, and this concept of the king as this kind of source of authority that had authority not over his own dynasty and his own territory, but the fact that the Commonwealth was that, and that the Commonwealth and the commonweal, or the body politic, was something that, although it belonged to him, it was not merely for his personal use. It was something that was to be shared for the common benefit of those who lived in the area, in the territory, in the realm. Thus, the king was like the father to the child, and that the purpose of this the realm was that it was for the benefit of the subjects. Even though the king had the authority to act, but his concern, it was more like a concept of caritas in the classical understanding, in Latin, in the sense, or the Greek word agape, in the sense of a form of love or caring love for the thing. Now, Heidegger would use the word care, right? This is the king cared. The king cared and ruled. Rule was a form of care, of bestowing benefit to them. Thus, in many sense, this is why Aristotle, in the beginning of the Politics, clearly says that kingly rule is distinct in character from political rule, because political rule is a case of mutual benefit, that the ruler and ruled are switch, that there's no clear distinction between who's ruler and ruled, that what ends up happening is that one is at one time ruled, and but then one over time may be picked to have authority, but then and reverts back to rule, and that the benefit here is not only for the purpose of it is the benefit all, both ruler and ruled. It's common benefit, not just merely the benefit of the ruled, whereas care primary directs at the other, not at it's not a sharing in the sense. Care is a giving in that. So therefore, monarchy, in the nature of monarchical law, is this kind of this aspect of directedness towards the common, the benefit of that. A sacrificial aspect. Again, the Christian tones of the Christ sacrificing himself, of giving himself, is very much underlying the concept of the king. Remember, in fact, one of the symbols of Christ is Christ as king, right? So therefore, Catholic medieval political theology saw the king as Christ-like in this aspect. And thus, like Christ, the king's two bodies, in the sense that as the king has the body within himself, the corporal physical body of his body, but also the body of his realm. And the crown came to symbolize that in medieval. Now, this is very much the point of the concept of the king's two bodies, is Ernst Kantorovic's famous book on this, which I think, though it gets a lot of attention in the postmodern literature and literature fields, and this for the concept of the body, and political theory, and the rise of since the 1990s of concern for political theology as understanding the state as a secularization of Christian concepts. coming out of Schmidt, right? Carl Schmidt and the writings of Schmidt, tied with the concepts of the bio life started with by people like Michel Foucault and Giorgio Agamben, and also as Deleuze, concerned about this kind of so-called biopolitics, which had nothing to do with the actual biology, but more of this concept of the distinction between mere life and biological life and kind of mere life and living one's life in terms of how human beings seek to live well. Well, again, this is an intentional echo in both Platonic and slash Aristotelian concerns of the concept between what the human good life was, and it was not merely the life in the community was not merely for the sake of necessity in life, but aimed towards the higher good life, the good. This and therefore Foucault and Agamben used this, but then framed it in a different way. Now, yes, the body politic language and this in Konotovich's concern about how the political form of life of the Commonwealth, using I think the term Commonwealth becomes present in the language of James I, clearly asserts that his authorities over, his thing was a common weal. This concept of commonwealth or common weal, that meant the common weal was a medieval concept that was something shared. This was the common land, the commons, as we understand from economics, the concept of tragedy of the commons. The commons are things that are shared, that no one owns specifically, or if someone does own it, like the king owns it, but it's not merely his for his own use or privilege. Now, there is territories and lands that are precisely only for the king in his private use. But the realm is that shared space between by which the subjects, those who live under his care, inhabit and enjoy. Thus, the crown, in this sense, becomes understood as the territory, this concept of the symbolic representation of the body politic, of the common weal, the common space by which all the people who are subject to this king are cared for by this ruler, inhabit and share. Now, as I said earlier, this becomes transferred. This medieval concept, which defined Plantagenet political thought, I suspect. Now, I do not find in my research looking at other things, I do not really see clearly the similar use of the crown in other French writers, Spanish writers, Italian writers. Of the same medieval period. We see the concept of the body politic talked about in France. We see the rise of the dynastic order, the dynasty, the king, the king's realm. German realm means Reich. That sense. The Reich is that territory of the Kaiser, which has Caesar. But it is England where this concept of the crown takes its place in legal language, as the crown became symbolic of what we would later call the state. We see elements of early in the Plantagenet rule, but it is after Tudor, post Tudor, that this really changes. That it becomes more prevalent, much more prevalent, and that the state is seen as the administrative element that has authority. It's not just the crown represents, and that all power emanates through the crown, including the power of judges, the power of parliament. Both come out from the crown. It's a delegation of the crown's authority. The parliament is not exercising its own authority or its own initiative. It is exercising and transferring the agency. And I think this is an important thing to understand in that sense. That there's this idea that the power of the agents, were like the judges and acting. The judge is exercising the king's power in that sense. The judge is exercising the authority of the king. The king has all the in the crown, in the king, all power, all vestiges of power, or by power it means here the aspects of authority connected with rule. But the concerns, starting with someone like Aristotle's famous division between the deliberative, the executive, in terms of the execution of law or the policies. Therefore, we have the idea of the body that deliberates and decides, um, which modern thinkers would call the legislative. To legislate, to leg is to decide in a sense. And then the executive is the executorial, that is executing the laws, or executing or enforcing and securing the laws. Also, the executive in the modern construction following law understands this idea of prerogative, that is, that the exercising of power of the whole for the sake of the whole. It is given often to the executive in that sense, who will be able, while the legislative, in the modern idea, the legislative is supreme, because it's the truly deliberative, the ones that has the authority to deliberate, and is authorized by the body through election of its members, by election of representatives of the various parts of the body politic. That it has the right and legitimacy to exercise deliberation, therefore make the laws, make the rules. Again, this is coming from the post-Hobbesian, post-Lockean framing of this, which Montesquieu basically, Montesquieu's famous use of separation of powers in the spirit of the laws echoes in that sense, even though while he doesn't accept the social contract and lots of the Hobbesian framework of this, he still accepts the concept of power. Now, I have to admit that I kind of rushed it. It predates Montesquieu's divisions are found clearly and somewhat founded in Locke and clearly founded in Hobbes. But the earlier idea found in Aristotle and the medieval writers, of the separation of function, this idea of division of labor within the rule. Rule has this division between deciding, executing, and adjudicating. Right? That's the third criteria, both in Aristotle's discussion of it in the end of Before the Politics, and various medieval writers writing from the Aristotelian tradition, 15th and 16th century, 14th, 15th century. And this is kind of important to to understand that this vision of function. Now, what does this mean in terms of this? Now, a lot of people argue that this meant separate realms of authority. No, under the English concept of the crown, all authorities within the order of the king. He is both lawmaker, executor, and the judge. Now, in a small community, this one person can do this. But as given that this is a large territory, what ends up happening is kind of king has to delegate. He can't do it, so he wants people to do it. He doesn't create separate bodies, or he doesn't allow for separate bodies to start executing power on their own. Rather, he sends representatives under his authority to execute and act in behalf of him. It is not their power, it is his power that they're exercising. And thus, when you disobey the the representative. You're not merely disobeying and showing disrespect for the representative. You're showing disrespect for he who sent him, whose power he's exercising, disrespecting the king. And to show disrespect for the king in most things, or disobey the king, was treason. Hence the concept of the purpose of the king was to maintain the peace. Therefore, to disobey the king's law, or to to not obey what the king has commanded, was a breach of the king's peace. And therefore, the king's job was to secure the peace. And therefore, if you were a person breaking the peace, that he could use coercion and violence to to prevent you from doing that, to restore peace, to restore order. So therefore, judges, magistrates, and authorities weren't exercising their own authority. They were exercising the authority of the crown that was delegated. And bodies emerged. First, the courts. The courts. And although the concept of independent judiciary emerges, the idea of judges were appointed for life, as soon as became appointed for life, or times later periods, the autonomy of the judges from political decisions. But what's very interesting here is that even though autonomy was done, still the real authority was from the crown. The judges were not exercising their own power; they were exercising a power delegated. And this is something very interesting in law, English law, or a grant of right. That a grant of right cannot be something arbitrarily held back. In other words, it's like and in many ways it was a contract. As long as the party executing it was performing it in good faith, doing what was doing it there, and it was following the procedure, then the grantor had no legitimate right to retain or take back. In other words, something had to go amiss before the crown could arbitrarily take back. Thus, the actions of the Stuart, particularly Charles I, in his attempt to overturn and direct or command Parliament to do what it wanted, was in many sense a violation, even though, in his mind, I'm the king, I'm in charge. His father, James the First, or James the Sixth of Scotland, who wrote in his famous Divine Right of Kings a treatise, put a unique concept, even though you can argue that the English crowns were always kind of absolute, always kind of all power was in them. Well, that was true, but the exercise of that power operated through the law. And English law had certain customs to it, certain procedures of customs and practices. That is, once a right or thing was done, it could not be. I could not, once I transferred land to you, I sold something under contract and agreement. I couldn't just change my mind and say I want it back. In other words, I had to show that the contract was false, that you cheated me, that there was some kind of force or fraud involved that would agree for the nullification of the contract and the return of what was agreed to back. Thus, what we have here is a very important limitation to even the delegation of power. That once the delegation to these bodies emerged and the bodies continued in good faith and good practice, what emerged is these institutions, both first the courts throughout the crown, and then by the Tudors, Tudors took the Parliament, which was basically an advisory body, and it slowly became a means of legislating. The kings delegated lawmaking to them, and then over time that expanded and expanded and expanded to the point by the time of the the Stuarts, later Stuarts, Charles I. Charles started to go further than his father. His father was, although argued with this, was more prudent in his exercise. He would basically kind of not poke the parliamentary bear too much. Charles went too far. And what happened was the English Civil War, when they thought what the king was doing was beyond all right. That the king was not only trying to change the nature of the law, he was trying to bypass the decisions of his courts, and he was also trying to bypass the rulings and privileges, the procedure that has governed English practice regarding the creation of law and the creation of policy, particularly the raising of taxes, since Magna Carta required that there be the consent of the nobility and the representative land owners to that uh, 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 taxation tax. Thus, Parliament became the means by which the lords and the landed parties send their representative. I mean, the lords came themselves to the higher chamber, and the representatives of the non-aristocratic landowners elected by in the organizations of counties would send a representative agent to the parliament, and therefore that emerged the parliamentary structure. Again, they were not exercising a power or independent of their own. They were actually designed to be the basis by which the crown could exercise its power. Because after Magna Carta, the requirement was that the crown exercise its power through this. The law required the crown to get consent. Thus, the necessity for consent becomes the slow means by which the idea of the parliamentary bodies become the center for consent. And whereas the courts becomes the agents of adjudication, the crown still held the element of executive authority. And it is the idea of the emergence of governments, which occurs primarily in response to Charles and then later the successors of Charles, first William and Mary, then William by himself, then Anne, then the bringing of the Hanoverians, George the First, George the Third, from this point on. You had the creation of ministerial government. The ministers were really the agents of governance. The king slowly receded from being the actual agent of executing authority, executing went into the background as being kind of mere symbol, particularly by the time, the 20th century, mere symbol that acted nothing more than by which a minister told them what to do, what to say. So therefore, this is the crown in this sense becomes a very important concept. It also explains why I would argue that the English did not have the same the concept of the crown, the medieval structures, the medieval ideas, and the modern ideas of the state. The crown became the English use of the crown in the Middle Ages could easily the state and the crown could merge in that sense and not have the same conflict that was in the European concept. In other words, the creation of the monarchies and this is the famous claim that England's political trajectory was a kind of liberal trajectory, and the 16th century European is absolute this century. This is kind of a misleading element. What happened was, in many ways, England had a state by accident in 1066. In other words, the Norman conquest gave England a condition of political centralization that no other political or area had at that time equal. In other words, the King of England, by what the conquest, so centralized and so unified the territory and reestablished that the new aristocracy that emerged there were always his creatures, or the creatures of the crown. Thus, where this was not the case in the continent, often the kings of Spain and the kings of France had in their attempt to create their unification of French crown France had to, or in terms of the Spanish crown, in terms of someone like Charles, um, I'm forgetting. Ferdinand Ferdinand of Aragon, who becomes he really unifies Spain under his territory. He expels the Moors from Granada. He asserts he brings all the different regional principal states under his authority. He then gains an engagement that exercises authority, both not only within trying to participate in the affairs of Italy, but he becomes through Isabella's first through Columbus, and then his because his marriage with Isabella gives him her, her discoveries done in her name. Um, you get the Columbus and Amerigo Vespucci and the other explorers and the discovery of the New World, and the goods and wealth and the particularly in terms of food, the New World gives to the Spanish immense power that by which Ferdinand unifies this, and economic power, military power becomes to the point where even his descendant will become the elector of the Charles V, Charles who becomes Charles V of the Holy Roman Emperor, and the rise of the Habsburg owe its origins to Ferdinand Aragon's attempt to centralize power. So, but it had to do this at the expense of the other spheres of authority. The same thing with the rise of the Bourbon monarchy. All the attempts of the French monarchs, the Valois, and before that, I think um, they had to wrestle, or either they had to negotiate their power with other states, other not states, but also duchies and princes, in order to do this. That's the problem of Charlemagne. Charlemagne's rules, not the Holy Roman Emperor, were dependent on the electors, and this could not exercise authority. That he always had to negotiate from these powerful stateholders or landholders and the principalities and duchies that could constrain his authority. In other words, unless he had the means, economic means to do it himself, in order to get the money and the means from them, he had to negotiate with them. He couldn't command. The English crown could command. And that, of course, led to the famous rebellion against him at Runnymede, and led to Magna Carta. But even that, Magna Carta was, as scholars will tell you, Magna Carta has a unique history in how it developed. But again, the crown, the idea of the English crown gave a means by which the modern state could transmission without the necessary brutality in the English concept, because one, the conquest unified and centralized things much earlier, 1066, at least 600 years ahead of much of Europe. Um, in fact, thus the nature of English institutions are devolution of power through decentralization. So by the time the state comes into play in the 16th century, into this, the state ideas come into England at the time of the Tudors. What happens is they already have a pre-existing symbol, a pre-existing kind of political representation of the crown that can be easily modified into shape and use this. Now, I think this is enough. I would recommend people who are interested in understanding the King's Two Bodies to see Ernst Kantorovic's King's Two Bodies. There's not much literature about this. One of the greatest plays of Shakespeare, Richard II. The imagery of the crown is one of the most imagery. This is something Kantarova points out in the book. Richard, in his myth of the crown as a hollow crown, symbolizing the emptiness of otherness and sacrifice in monarchy. This is not really something worth having in that sense. I would recommend watching Richard II for those of you interested in this, see this element of this transition between the medieval world and because what we see with the rise of Bolingbroke is Shakespeare is using Bolingbroke to kind of point to the Tudors. Shakespeare is very much attempting to kind of give a justification for Tudor. Hence, this is why his Richard is the tyrant he is, and not the more nuanced, balanced historical character that recent histories and discovery understood how Richard III was. The Tudors are a very interesting aspect of change, an assertive power of the conquest that tries to hide the conquest in light of rightful succession, and particularly to the antecedent of the kind of Henry Tudor who marries Henry V's widow, and line that emerges from that, by which then the grandson will be seen as the son. The son will be seen as the brother of Henry VI, kind of brother. Legitimize him as the brother, but then his child will become the successor that will free England from the reign of Richard III. Again, the idea of the Yorkists, the fight between the Lancasters and the Yorkists, split the War of the Roses. Again, English political history, Shakespeare's historical plays are very good, kind of retelling this, but in light of the Tudors' victory and Tudors' reframing of English political history. So therefore, again, this is why Konatovich uses Shakespeare in this way. But at the same time, we should understand that this is not history. This is not, what Shakespeare is doing here is giving representation. Therefore, we access it through an idea that understanding that is not a completely historically accurate rendition of the truth, but a way to understand the transition between the medieval concept of the crown and the now modern concept, which requires commerce, trade, consent, more than the concept of the king as the caring Christ finger. But the problem here is that the reason why that figure is diminished is because of Richard's failures, his vanity and his shallowness and his immaturity. All of these things lead him to move badly, to make bad decisions. And that famous speech of John Galt, what happens to England, in that that beautiful speech there, again, is this perception of the king's responsibilities to care for that, and that the fact that this king is not. And therefore, the modern idea of consent of the king and the new state kind of being bound by law, bound by consent, bound by a practice, and the need to king's authority needs to be shored up with other institutions, support from other institutions, is very much a Tudor model, and therefore this is why the Tudor state works. But I will end here, and like this, please put some comments if you see. I would welcome criticism. Have a good day.